Okay, so thank you very much for being patient, and start with our first panel of the day whilst you're still digesting the minister's speech. And this is about focused on the old far right. And if you know ICSR, and I'm saying this to the panelists as much as I'm saying this to the audience here, at ICSR we always have quite a conversational format. So I would encourage you, and people in the audience are also expecting to get a chance to ask a lot of questions and interact with the panelists. So I plead with you to keep your remarks as brief and as succinct as possible. You will be able to speak as much as you want, just not all at once. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for being with us today to talk about this very important topic. Three very distinguished experts, and some of whom having practical experience with this issue. And I just want to kick off by asking everyone here on this panel from their particular perspective, and you have the biographies in front of you, to ask them how they see the so-called, what they see as the old far right, and how they see it doing today. And I want to start off with Matthew Collins, because he himself, at some point, I guess, was a member of what is now considered to be the old far right, chair of the London National Front, and now a leading member of Hope Not Hate. Matthew, how do you see it?
Well, I don't see there's too much difference between the old far right and what's being described as the new far right. Unfortunately, I don't know if that causes anyone panic or offence. The old far right, we're talking about the British National Party and the National Front organisations. I mean, the National Front's nearly it's over 50 years old, and the BNP is over 40 years old. These parties aren't the same parties they were in 67 and 82 when they were formed. They've also embraced new ideas, they've also embraced new trends, they've also embraced populism, none more so than the BNP. The BNP was on its knees. I think in 2010, 2011, it was as close to collapse as it could be. It shed, from 16,000 members to around 4,000 members. But it has survived, and it has survived. But no one calls it the new BNP. At the same time, Tony Blair was changing New Labour, Nick Griffin was changing old BNP. But no one seems to realise that party has changed quite dramatically. But what is interesting about the BNP, I mean, obviously now I do anti-racist and anti-fascist work, and I'm very good at it, and I'm available for hire as a photographer for weddings, parties, bar mitzvahs. What is interesting about the BNP is how few people looked at the BNP. I think there's 2,500 people in this country who are currently doing PhDs on the growth of the far right in this country, and of course the BNP is in decline, has been in decline since 2010, and nobody seems to realise it, and they're always ringing me up. And let's be very, very clear, it is a party that has declined, it is a party that has set its level, it is a party that engages in the democratic process. But in 2009, when it really grew, it got 1 million votes, it got 2 MEPs, it already had a member of the Greater London Assembly. It had vanquished almost the rest of the far right. The National Front had collapsed, all the tiny other little splinter parties around it had collapsed. But then a month before the BNP got that 1 million votes and swept aside everything in the far right, we then had the growth of the EDL, the English Defence League. I mean, how was there room for that to happen? How did that happen? And I think that's where the idea, because it was a new trend and it wasn't as political as the BNP, people sort of thought that the EDL represented a new direction in the right, because the EDL focused on Islam and the BNP traditionally focused on Judaism. But of course, way before the EDL arrived in 2009, 2002, Nick Griffin made a speech that almost landed him in prison about Islam. It led actually to laws in this country being changed, and people seem to have forgot about that. And here we are now, 2013, the new right, or the EDL is what people are talking about the new right is the new far right. The EDL is as good as collapsed, it's as good as finished, it's been in decline since 2012, and it as good as finished in September 2012 when it couldn't march for the first time ever, despite years and years of people having protests and smash and stop the EDL. It was actually finally stopped just once in Walthamstow. But we'd been predicting its decline for a long time because the BNP was a larger party, it was a political party, and after being pretty squarely kicked in the groin by the growth of the EDL, it fought back because the BNP had politics. And the thing about the EDL was it had no politics. There was no relationship between these people in Europe, these counter-jihadists. They had no relation intellectually or socially with the people on the ground in the EDL. And the thing about the EDL is, and was, the EDL, of course, it said it was different, so people wanted to believe it, particularly the Daily Express and the Daily Star newspapers, that, it's not a racist organisation because it says it's not. It's not a fascist organisation because it says it's not. It's not homophobic because it says it's not. It's not anti-Semitic because it says it's not. But actually, when you actually looked at what the EDL was, it might have said it wasn't racist, but it certainly wasn't anti-racist. It might have said it wasn't homophobic, but it certainly wasn't, fighting homophobia. All it did was present all those ills, those problems, those policies as coming from the Muslim community. And so when the EDL collapsed and fell to bits, as it did do, the vast majority of people had walked away from it. And we'd studied the far right, and we knew every far right activist in this country, but in 2009, the EDL got a few thousand people who we'd never heard of, who hadn't been involved in the BNP, out on the streets, and they fell away as quickly as they came to the organisation. And now we look at the EDL, and it's 4 or 5 splinter groups, and these groups are no longer counter-jihadists. They are similar to the BNP as it was in 2002 and 1982. They are racist. They are large-scale homophobes, racists. They're calling for an end to immigration and a start to repatriation. So I don't think you can say the EDL was part of a new far right, because the reality of it is the far right is still underpinned by the ideas of conspiracy theory, the traditional far right along Standing National Front and BNP, of course, that there is a Jewish conspiracy, the Protocols of Zion, and this new far right, which we're talking about the EDL, which never caught on amongst their membership, like ideas about Jewish conspiracies did in the BNP, about Eurabia. Yep. Still driven by conspiracy theories, be it Jewish conspiracy theories, Islamic conspiracy theories. It is all exactly the same, because it just boils down to the traditions of it.
Matthew, let me stop you here, and bring in Roger Griffin, and pick up on the point that Matthew made, which is essentially that the differences between the old and the new are perhaps exaggerated. They're perhaps not as great as we think they are. What do you think of that?
Well, I'd like to chuck in, I'm here not as an activist or as somebody who's had direct experience of being part of any group, but as a boring old university lecturer who spent a lot of time looking at the interwar right, especially the fascist right. And I'd just like to chuck in a couple of perspectives. One is a historical perspective, which is that the right is one of these horribly fuzzy concepts. It emerges from the French Revolution because the section that was really radically against the monarchy in any form, constitutional or what, sat on the right in the National Assembly. It's only after 1870 that people start talking about the right in France as an ideological concept, but it obviously fits a sort of semantic gap there because it proliferates and it becomes part of the socio-political, journalistic and political science jargon in the late 19th century, and it's treated by the 1890s in Europe with a profusion of rights. There were Catholic rights, there were monarchist rights, there were anti-Semitic rights, there were modernizing rights, there were rights that got in bed with syndicalism, and you get sort of national syndicalist rights. This is before the First World War. And of course, what makes it even more complicated is that so-called liberal countries, which are technically not meant to be far right, still gave up millions of people to be slaughtered in the First World War for ultranationalist causes of God and country, which makes the boundaries between right and ultra-right rather dodgy. I mean, I would say that far more people died for the liberal right in the First World War than for any recognisable far right. So the right is a really dodgy term, one. Two, historically it evolves, and it varies from country to country, and there's also a sort of patterns in the way it evolves. So now my specialism is the interwar period. The fascist right at the time in the interwar period was definitely a new right at the time. Why? Because it deliberately, in different countries, and in every country it's a very different right, creates an alliance between a rhetoric of nationalism, but of a post-liberal nationalism, anti-communist nationalism. The right keeps evolving because its enemies keep evolving. There was no anti-communist right at the end of the 19th century in any radical sense till the Russian Revolution put it on the map. When the liberal capitalist world collapsed in 1918 in terms of its credibility, it created a space for a new right which got into power in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Very, very different fascisms, but you could characterize the post-war right, which is now apparently old right, as an attempt to revive the fascism, and one very significant form of that is universal Nazism. And what happens after the 1945 is there's a whole load of people, and they're still around today, who see Nazism not as a German nationalism, but as an Aryan global myth that Hitler was right, not because he tried to make Germany great, but because he tried to save the Aryan race from multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, Jews, Negroes, communism, the whole thing. Now, I would argue in terms of, if I was doing this for my students, I'd say as an ideal type, in other words, as a sort of useful way of hanging something on these terms, in the post-war period, you can broadly distinguish a nostalgic, mimetic right, which looks back to the interwar period for its models, and I would include National Front along those, from a very interesting set of new phenomena which are broadly a sort of new right, like neo-populism, Le Pen, which isn't fascist technically, but the French new right, very intellectual, Nouvelle Droite stuff. But also, it's all got incredibly complicated, because if you look at, say, the Breivik attack on Norwegian society, he takes out Labour Party members because they're the Trojan horse of multiculturalism. He actually celebrates Israel because it defends its race. He admires Al-Qaeda because they defend their race. This is not a recognizable old right. It uses internet, it uses Al-Qaeda terrorist tactics. I mean, I do think it's useful to think of in the final sentence of the right as a dodgy term, very fuzzy in its boundaries, constantly evolving in terms of what it's against. And in the post-war period, where liberal capitalism has re-established itself and multiculturalism has become the main danger to senses of national identity, and there's also a very strong complication in the relationship between racism and nationalism, because they're not the same thing and they shift around all over the place. You start getting, with the internet and Al-Qaeda and terrorism, you start getting new forms of right possible, some extremely intellectual, which say they're nothing to do with politics, populist forms which say we love France but only for the French, whatever that means, neo-populism, and terroristic forms which are very different. If you read the 1,500 pages of Breivik on the web, it's a taxonomic nightmare for people who want to say, what is this? It's definitely not left, and it's definitely not liberal, but I think neo or new right is a useful term, but we have to be very careful to look at particularities. I mean, I would say, for example, modern Russia is an extremely right-wing country, but in a way which is really baffling, because it's got so much of constitutionalism, and it's a sort of mishmash. So I would say, interesting conference. I'm here really to learn a bit more about what to tell my own students. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's a slightly different perspective now.
Yeah.
I sense already a little bit of disagreement coming up, and we'll get into that in a second.
I'll see you outside.
I've got to look at what half those words were you were using first of all.
Oh yeah. Well,
Well, I would never challenge a former National Front member to a bust-up.
this is your fear.
I never was. I was born this big.
I want to bring in Maria here. Maria is London correspondent for The Nation magazine, and she's been covering the crisis in Greece. And of course, one of the features that often bubble up in that crisis is the emergence of the so-called Golden Dawn, a new form of old far right, new far right. You tell us, Maria.
Well, it's very interesting that I was very interested in two things that Roger said. One is about universal Nazism, and the other is about the continuity between the right and the far right. When I was asked to speak on this panel, I said to Katie, well, actually, Golden Dawn is not old right, it's new right, but I'm not so sure. It has elements of continuity and elements of newness. Just in case people don't know very much about it, it is a neo-Nazi party. It was formed as a magazine around 1980 by a man called Michael Oliakos, who met some of the members of the junta that ruled Greece between 67 and 74 while he was in prison for possession of explosives. It started to come to prominence in the 90s over the issue of Macedonia and the naming of the Republic of Macedonia, and with the first wave of migrants coming into Greece from Albania and from Eastern Europe. In 2009, in the election, it got 0.29% in the polls. In the city council elections in 2010, it elected its first member, the leader, Michalogliakos, to the Athens City Council from a central Athens neighbourhood where there are many destitute asylum seekers and migrants living. He came into the Athens City Council and immediately gave a fascist salute. In last summer's election, it got 7% in the polls and now has 18 seats in Parliament, and now it's polling between 10 and 14%. So it's a really rapid rise. These people are very violent. They beat up people of colour or people they suspect of being gay or people who they just don't like the look of on the street regularly. They've committed a few murders, a couple of murders known to be committed by Golden Dawn sympathisers. They have a whole subculture with music, heavy metal. They have a band called Pogrom. It's like, Auschwitz, Speak Greek or Die, lovely titles like that. They are into football, some of them, and there's this whole sort of style thing, bodybuilding thing among young men, black T-shirts, shaved heads. Their symbol, as you may have seen, is a Greek meander, which is designed to look rather like a swastika, and which they claim is an ancient Greek symbol. Everything that we associate with Nazi Germany, iconographically, the swastika, the salute, they claim comes from ancient Greece, especially from the Spartans. They like the Spartans. Well, exactly. This is the thing. So, the Nazis saw ancient Greece as the root of Aryan culture. Golden Dawn has gone back to this. In their magazine, through the 80s and 90s, they very much sort of promoted Nazis themselves, pictures of Hitler on the cover, Rudolf Hess, and actually explicitly said that Greece should have been at the side of the Axis during the Second World War because this then we would have had a Europe rooted in ancient Greek culture and not in the terrible Judeo-Christian miasma, as they call it, which has taken over Europe and infected it with Jewish obscurantism. So they are neo-Nazis in that sense, also in the sense that they are against both communism and capitalism. They speak out against the crisis as having been a crisis of greed and corruption. They say we are the only pure Greeks, the only ones who are not corrupt. They are deeply, deeply racialist. They speak about Greek blood. They have blood drives for Greeks only. They're very interested in blood. And here they actually tap into a Greek nationalist tradition that goes back to the beginnings of the modern Greek state, which is one of the things that has enabled them to become so powerful. And they are explicitly anti-democratic, even though they are in parliament. They say that ideally the Volk, the Laos, the people, will express themselves through a supreme leader who will know their will and express their will. So they are old right, but they're also new. They have these cultural features of the new right, the music, the style.
Social media as well.
Social media, they're very big on social media. But the other thing that is really, really important about what's happening in Greece at the moment that I very much wanted to bring to everyone's attention is the growing evidence of a sort of continuum between Golden Dawn and some members of the New Democracy Party in power in government now. Golden Dawn has influenced government policy already extensively, for example, in the government's approach to the migration crisis in Greece, which is a real crisis, and I would attribute it to a large extent to Europe's failure to come up with a working immigration policy, and in particular to the Dublin II agreement, and to Europe's wish to keep migrants on the periphery and keep them from entering Northern Europe. So I've lost my thread there. What was I talking about? Oh yes, so the government's response to this, rather than setting up proper reception centres or a proper asylum system in Greece, has been to launch this programme called Xenios Zefs, with use of hospitality, where migrants are rounded up on the street, or rather anyone who looks foreign is rounded up on the street, taken into detention, But out of 80,000 people, this is the police's own figures, rounded up in the last 6 months, only 4,500 were found to have been in the country illegally and arrested. Then there's a new citizenship law under discussion in Greece. The government has overturned a law passed by the previous socialist government which gave children of immigrants born in Greece to parents who had been there legally for at least 5 years the right to claim citizenship. This has been overturned by the Council of State in Greece following an election promised by Samaras. And there's a new citizenship law under discussion which will be a law based much more on jus sanguinis rather than jus solus. Then recently 85 New Democracy MPs tabled a motion in Parliament, or rather an amendment to a motion, which would exclude anyone who was not of Greek race from joining the armed forces or the police. And we have a situation where the police have been seriously infiltrated by Golden Dawn, especially in some parts of Athens, and also it would seem parts of the judiciary. Last week, a Golden Dawn MP and the party's spokesman Ilias Kassidiaris was tried for allegedly participating in a stabbing of a student in 2007, taken until now for his case to come to trial. The courtroom was packed with Golden Dawn Braves in black T-shirts, and he was acquitted after 2 days for lack of evidence by a judge who is also known to have defended a number of Greek oligarchs on trial for corruption associated with the two major ruling parties. So there's much more to say about all that, but here we have universal Nazism and continuity between the right and the far right.
Matthew, let me ask you, when you hear Maria talking about the Golden Dawn, clearly, if you put yourself in the mind that you were in the 1980s, these would have been much more your people than Anders Breivik, right?
Well, Golden Dawn is part of, Maria said, part of that new far right, but it's a neo-Nazi party. Very, very similar. I think the thing about the far right, the fascist far right, is that despite all this, that we're all Aryans and we're all white and we all want to get along very, very well, these organisations have, of course, national characteristics. Hitler was right, the Aryan race. If you were to come and see me in the 1980s when I was sitting at my little desk with my little Union Jack and my typewriter that didn't work, typing out letters to the Newham Gazette about immigration, I would have said, well, the Greeks aren't Aryans. Neither are the Italians. They're not Aryans. I'm Aryan. You know, blonde hair, blue eyes, no hairs on my chest. I'm an absolute Aryan, as per the book. So, despite all these things, in every country they have national characteristics, and the Greek national characteristic is that all civilization, not just in Greece, but for them, all civilization begins there, the same way that Hitler did. And of course, in the National Front, all civilization sort of began after 1966 when England won the World Cup. But on the that's a joke. On the, not a good one. On the national characteristics, I remember this whole thing about how the British would never bow and scrape to Germany. And even though we were neo-Nazis and we would Nazi salute things, we couldn't get over the fact that we'd gone to war with Germany and we'd won it. And beating Germany at anything was fantastic, and all war is good. And we had these German visitors over, and we laid on the traditional sort of English buffet for them, crisps, pork pies. It was fantastic. And after about 4 hours of all this very, very heavy drinking, which of course is what the far right do, very heavy drinking, at about 11:15, someone started this song. Now, we're all neo-Nazis, right? Someone started this song that football fans do, which is called 10 German Bombers, and the RAF from England shot them down. And then by the time we got, you count up, by the time we got to 10, we were all throwing our glasses and sausage rolls at the Germans, and then we attacked them for being krauts. So we weren't very, very good as part of this international thing. But yes, I think on paper at the time we would have liked Golden Dawn, but we wouldn't have necessarily agreed with, and obviously the Greek Golden Dawn obviously got on very well with the BNP, but obviously when it boiled down to it, leave them together in a small room and they'll start a war with each other because they can't actually agree who is the most superior culture, what is the best culture, and these sort of things.
And isn't that precisely the new thing, that they are now talking about cultural nationalism, a European cultural nationalism that is not so strong on these national differences. It
Well-
tries to overcome that to some extent.
Well, Roger will answer this better than I will, but I think I can only look at the English context or the British context. What I've seen is that a lot of these organisations copied the National Front because it was the largest post-war fascist party in Europe, and then all over Europe, people have these defence leagues have copied the English Defence League, but all of these organisations have national characteristics. What is the characteristic of Breivik, which is interesting, which everyone agrees with, whether they're BNP or Golden Dawn or EDL, was that there is an Islamic Marxist conspiracy.
And there is a very strong anti-Islamic streak in Golden Dawn because there's no mosque in Athens.
Yeah.
So,
Can I just unpack that phrase, Islamic Marxist conspiracy? What Breivik makes very clear. By the way, he says if he could, he would have, in 1944, he would have taken a plane and gone to Germany and shot Hitler.
Yeah.
Because Nazism gave racism a bad name. And he says, well, no, seriously. And he's quite, he's a strange mixture, like a lot of these sort of ideologically, articulately clever Nazis or extreme racists. They mustn't be dismissed as total nutters or stupid. That's a great, great danger, to underestimate the intelligence of these people. He's concocted his own syncretic worldview. He's done a bit of research. He's done far more research than most of my students. He's used the web. He's used the web just about as much. He creates this narrative, right? But the point about the Marxists is that they've let in, because they're so PC that they don't dare talk about, they love all races and they don't believe in national identity. Marxism has become in Norway Labour-type PC. It's so diluted, but by embracing multiculturalism, they've let the Muslims in. Now, it's not that Muslims and Marxists have formed a sort of alliance. It's that, but if you're soft on identity, you encourage multiculturalism. And he says he admires Al-Qaeda for defending its race and Jewish state for defending its race. All he wants is for a sort of, it's a fortress mentality. He wants races to recognise the importance of roots and identity, and not have, and this is the great fear of the fascist mentality, if you like, right-wing mentality, I think. It's a fear of chaos represented in various forms, transgendering, confusions about lesbians and homosexuals, the masses, the feminized masses, globalism, the United Nations, and all sorts of forces which are sort of undermining. I mean, if you want a little comic sketch on this, you watch the Kubrick film, How I Gave Up Worrying and Learnt to Love the Bomb, where Peter Sellers is a paranoid army base captain who thinks that fluoridization of water is undermining American virility. Now that's a perfect conspiracy theory. And so what I'm saying is that yes, conspiracy theory, but what's fascinating about the far right is that there are different permutations of conspiracy, and you've got to look at them very seriously because they motivate action. So you can't just generically say, oh yeah, they're all paranoid. You've got to see what their paranoia is and recognize that paranoids have, you can be paranoid and persecuted at the same time. And some of these people have genuine points to make about the nature of multiculturalism and globalization. Two, as I was trying to say earlier, if we keep looking back to the past to understand the future, we're like the French with the Maginot Line. The fact is that they would have won the First World War again with the Maginot Line, but the Second World War was Stuka bombers and tanks, and it was useless. If you keep looking back to the interwar period to look at the right, you will miss all sorts of new subtle forms of right. For example, purely cultural intellectual right, Nouvelle Destre, Nouvelle Droite, Neue Rechte, which has a very powerful effect in giving intellectual, and these people are PhD, brilliant people with habilitations, as they're called, bigger than all the books I've ever read. They're clever people. And they are using history and culture to rework biological racism in a way which means that they can say absolutely straight, I am not a Nazi. And they are right. It's no use sending people to interview the BNP as if it's a straightforward Nazi party. It has, at least at the level of policy, ditched biological racism, and it talks the new speak of the right, which is about identity and culture and homogeneity and all that stuff, and the threat of multiculturalism. Now, let's be clear here. I think actually multiculturalism is even starting to be recognised now in British politics finally, that you can actually talk about race and immigration without being a right-wing bastard. You know, that it is actually, there are issues about immigration, mass immigration, multiculturalism and identity. And the fact is that by not talking about it intelligently from a liberal position, a space has opened up for other people to come in, and I think Breivik's half right on that point. PC, you know, political correctness, which he sees as a plot against the nation, has actually created a space which means that the far right can take it up in a way that appeals to a lot of people who feel that key issues are not being addressed. What amazes me is just how pathetically small the far right is in England, given our structural problems and our incredible degree of integrated mass immigration. And I think if you had deluged Weimar Germany with iPods and iPads and social media, Hitler wouldn't have had a look in. I mean, I think that there's been a massive depoliticization in the modern world, and the most dangerous thing is to have a situation of economic collapse where lots of young people are bored and have no access to social networks, etc., because you then have and good weather, as in Greece. I mean, the weather would kill mass politics here. So I'm saying, you know, so I think, you know, I think it's absolutely fascinating. But what we need is lots and lots of really wonderful to hear properly about the Golden Dawn. We need lots of really specialist knowledge to build up a mosaic of what's going on, rather than have this block category, the far right, and then talk in stupid, nonsensical journalistic terms about it is rising, it is falling, it is fading away, it is alarming. There's no it. And this is, for one thing I can get my students to get their head around, there's no such thing as historians say. There are not historians, and there isn't a far right. These are block terms. And if you want the government to do something about it, you have to be extremely careful what bit of the it you're dealing with. And our blindness about what the far right is leads to a lot of confused policies in trying to get rid of illiberalism.
Roger. Maria.
Two things actually come up partly out of what you're saying. One is I agree with you that it is the far right who talk about the relationship between globalization and migration in a way that the centre and the left have failed to do. And this is a real problem because you know, the answer they come up with is deeply simplistic and destructive and useless. The other thing is that people are always asking me, well, what other far-right groups is Golden Dawn affiliated with? And they're really not. They're not. I mean, they went and joined a demonstration with the NPD in Germany recently, which was very odd because the NPD likes to kick Greek immigrants in Germany too. So, and they were asked about this at one point, and they said, no, well, we understand. We would do the same if people were coming into our country. So it's like, you know, if you're a Greek in Greece, you're fine. But if you're a Greek migrant, and they've set up branches in Canada and New York. But, you know, some connection maybe with the Forza Italia, connections through football, little branch, Alba Dorata in Trieste. But, you know, there's Casa Pound in Italy, which we haven't talked about, which is a very, very interesting movement. No connections there. Because
except at the causal level.
Yes, but I don't think they were supposed to be in 2005 some far-right summer camp in the Peloponnese, which the then government stopped. It's the last time they ever stopped anything like this.
Let me, before I open this to the audience, let me put to you my little hypothesis here, which is that new far-right is potentially more of a threat, maybe not even in terms of violence, but politically, because it has removed two of the main impediments of the old far-right, two of the main obstacles that prevented the old far-right from ever being very successful. Number one, the obsession with Jews, at least publicly, which most people in this country, most people in Western European countries can't really, it doesn't really mean that much to them anymore. There are bigger threats or perceived threats. There's the threat from Islam, which most people would consider to be, in that milieu, would consider to be far more significant than Jews, which seems to be a very first half of the 20th century concern. Second, that they have overcome this exclusive nationalist tendency and this reference to Nazi Germany, which of course doesn't work, as Matthew said, in countries that fought Nazi Germany or that were occupied by Nazi Germany. And so, Matthew just explained it. They were meeting with Germans, and 4 hours later they were fighting.
Yes, but
and so a lot of people in England will never vote for a Nazi party because of what England is and stands for, right?
No, I think we all disagree.
No.
You kick it.
No.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me. I mean, I just want to say briefly. If you heard some of the things I've heard in Greek villages and small towns about what they now think happened during the German occupation of Greece, which was catastrophic, involved huge massacres, burning of thousands of villages. Oh, people say the Germans didn't really hurt anybody. They didn't hurt women and children. They say that all the damage done by the Germans was reprisals against the left, which was the left resistance. And this is where, there's another piece I think it's missing in what you've said, which is that the sort of shrinking of the left in Europe has also opened the way to the rise of the far right, and it helped to make it possible to say things which would have been unacceptable 10 years ago. And I think that's a really important thing. And I think also 9/11 changed things dramatically here. Yes. It became acceptable after that to have a kind of Islamophobic rhetoric and a racist rhetoric that was not okay before that. I think those two things are very important.
Matthew.
Oh, right. We are aware that the BNP does not fly swastikas and put leaflets through people's doors talking about putting people on buses and coaches and sending them back east. Anymore. Exactly. Anymore. The BNP is a political party which has 200 people out of its entire membership who are allowed to vote. They're the ones who know what's going on. The BNP is a party that just goes to people's doorsteps more than the left. The left have totally deserted this whole campaign thing. The BNP goes to people's doors and it talks about issues about your washing machine, your dryer, your garden, and of course these are all related to immigration, but it's not knocking on people's doors who are voting for them and saying we're going to get them all out on a boat and get rid of them. It's a party that's dropped its compulsory repatriation policy, and to a degree people say, well, they can't be that bad anymore. Of course, the reality of it is they create an environment where if you're black, Muslim, Asian, you can't work or go to school here anyway, you have to leave.
But they can still be tied to it. They may have dropped it. When Nick Griffin goes in Question Time, he's being asked about his Holocaust denial for about 20 minutes.
But let's look at the political literature of the people we're talking about who vote for them. And how much time do people actually give over to politics at the moment? And the BNP knocking on your door, talking about issues that matter to you more than any other party. I mean, we saw it in 2009, that was an enormous political machine, and the people knocking on the doors on behalf of the BNP weren't neo-Nazis either. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who joined the BNP, did so because it wasn't a Nazi party, it was a patriotic British party, and those people, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who were decent, sort of lower middle class types, had cultural worries. They were worried about cultural, culture being eradicated or whatever, or the creeping mass of immigration and the English culture slipping away. They weren't Nazis either, and that's what why
those are the ones who did join. What about the ones who didn't join, where they may be prevented from joining by thinking maybe, that is, whilst I agree with them, they are a bit fascist.
But there's people, the Labour Party doesn't have 4 or 5 million members, does it? But, it's one of those things. People voted for the BNP, protest because we don't have that immigration debate, or we certainly don't have a sensible immigration debate in this country. But the BNP, I would say, yes, at its core, those 200 people it allows to vote in the party is a Nazi party. But Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who pay their subs every week and get the BNP's newspaper through the door with horror stories about Islam and halal meat and things like that, aren't Nazis. And this is the whole problem as well. In 2009 was how did some people respond to the rise of what was a neo-Nazi party, was to go and just wave flags at it and say the BNP are Nazis and not address those issues.
Roger. Just 2 quick points. Just to show how complicated things have got in the last 20 years, there's a lovely book by George Michael, not the singer, called The Enemy of My Enemy, and it's about an incredible tendency amongst really high-powered, hardcore ideological Nazis in America and in Switzerland and 1 or 2 other countries to become Muslims. They changed their name, and 9/11 recruited a lot of these people because the Nazi sort of elite in the world feels very impotent to change things. 9/11, wow, I mean, if only they could have done that. There's there's real admiration for the total dedication, ruthlessness, incredibly effective tactics, and you get and so just to show how complicated things are, I would call that a new form of right when a guy called Ahmed Huber becomes or a Daimut become Muslims. 1, 2, we really mustn't underestimate the impact, at least symbolically, of Le Pen. Le Pen created a way in France, and he does come from a fascist milieu, or nostalgic fascist milieu. One of the amazing things that happened in the 60s in France, they looked at the failure to stay in Algeria, they looked at the failure of biological racism and to go back, and they said, look, we've got to change our discourse. And Nick Griffin has been recorded making a speech where he says the same thing. Yeah. Racism, Nazism, Holocaust stuff, hatred's out. What we've got to talk about now is culture, identity, and quite specific this. You get the Nouvelle Droite, Alain de Benoit, and you get Le Pen positioning himself as not anti-liberal democracy, but anti the watering down of French identity. So you get Les Français d'abord, which actually Britain first was the slogan of Mosley, but now it's the image that you can be extreme right, get a mass base, by not talking about changing the system, revolution, destroying France or destroying Britain to create a new one, but by Britain for the British, is a very powerful ploy. And I would argue, Golden Dawn is positioned between a revolutionary party and a neo-populist party. Does it ever talk about destroying Greece to create a single-party state?
It doesn't talk about, wouldn't talk about destroying Greece, God forbid, or the Olympian God forbid.
Or rebuilding Greece.
But yes, rebuilding Greece,
well, under
absolutely.
a single party, getting rid of party politics.
It doesn't explicitly say in public that it wants to get rid of public, but if you look at the website, and they have a whole ideological thing, it says, we will have, the people will express themselves through one leader.
Yeah, well, they are. So what we've got is sort of double think now. It's possible to have a double think, where the official line is we are a political party. Now, Hitler and Goebbels are people who are absolutely explicit. We're getting into power in order to destroy the Weimar Republic and create a single-party state. That rhetoric now, they've got far more subtle. They've got the mentality of publicity and advertising. They know how slogans work, and I think that they're careful to use a rhetoric which can be taken either as revolutionary or as just radical right, liberal democracy.
You're right, but one of the things that's very frightening about what's happening in Greece now, and that I really hope this doesn't spread, although I think it's happened somewhat in Hungary, is that it has become more and more acceptable to talk in this way. I mean, the way it happens in Greece is because faith in the old political system has generally collapsed. They're able to say, well, we are clean, we're pure, we're not corrupt, we're the only ones who are really for the Greeks. But in that message is exactly that thing, we're going to make a one-party state.
And can I just say, if we really want to look at where we might be going, if a lot of these tendencies go and study Hungary. I know the language is difficult, but there's a lot translated. What you have there with the Jobbik Party and some of the, like the House of Terror and the whole stuff, is an incredible, and it's not Aryan Nazi, but it is incredibly Hungarian. It's Magyarism, accommodated within a party political system which is itself part of the European Union, and yet they have created almost silently, velvet revolution of the right, a sort of right which is really scary, because it's not in the street beating up people, it's institutionalized, and it's a very scary possibility for democracies which subtly become right-wing.
Can I ask a question of my fellow panelists here, which is really, and one of the things I've been very concerned about is this thing of how do you make a line between acceptable right-wing politics and discourse and unacceptable extreme right discourse, because that is what is really blurring in Greece now. The Greek Home Office has hired as an advisor on its immigration law a man called Yannis Kotoulas, who is the author of a revisionist work on the Third Reich, which says exactly what you were saying before. We misunderstand Nazism if we lump it together with the madness of Hitler, and it was a revolution against bureaucratization and for young people. There's been a small uproar in Greece about this, but how do you draw those lines? Where do you put those lines without censoring free speech and so on?
Oh, well, I mean, I think Britain actually does have a very good theoretical base for that, and some other countries as well. But if you go back to the basic premises of liberalism, J.S. Mill, etc. I mean, he had no solution to nationalism. Very confused about nationalism. But there are some fundamental principles which a lot of people have worked on. United Nations universal rights, etc. I mean, it's very, very clear, actually. Now, how they interpret in terms of citizenship law and all sorts of stuff is a very complicated thing. But the main thing is that the spirit of democracy, I mean, you've got an incredible situation in Holland, for example, with Wilders, where, now, there's another example of the new, I call that new right, you see, because he's not out there with swastikas, he's in Parliament, and he's creating and doing clever media stunts and contacting our politicians, etc. And he represents what I would call, in terms of liberal theory, a perversion of liberal principles. The paradox of a liberal system is that it's never really confronted the idea that if, or a democratic system, what if the majority of the people are racist? I mean, you know, how do you, if you are held by the principles of democratic representation and the vast mass of people are actually anti-liberal principles, you end up with a legally constituted illiberal democracy.
Roger, just to press you for an answer, quick answer to that question. Where do you draw the line?
Oh, well, I wouldn't, but I would love to work in a committee with people made up of faith leaders, minority ethnic group leaders, politicians, lawyers, etc., and have a real parliament on this, because I think, and probably not in Britain, but I'm sure people are working on this as I speak in Strasbourg and Brussels, etc., but it is feasible. I'm saying, as an idealistic, disillusioned humanist sitting here, that it is possible. I mean, you know, torture, persecution, etc., you know, the sense of injustice, the sense of wrong, whether you're secular or religious, that's your starting point. It must come from the gut. And the consequences of certain things, and a constant monitoring of you know, a sense of complexity, a sense of consequences. I can't do that. It would take a long time, but I don't think it's beyond the wit of human beings, properly motivated, to come up with enforceable policies.
Matthew, do you have any idea for how to talk about this in an acceptable way? Where to draw the line?
Difficult, because people want more, and you can get more. You can go on the internet and you can get whatever you want. You can say whatever you want on Twitter. I can say whatever I want about Roger on Twitter. If I delete it after 20 minutes, he can't sue me. There are laws in this country that protect people, and there are limits, and protects the limits you can go to, and it protects people's right to feel offended and respond to it. But I don't know, I agree with everything Roger said on that very subject.
Can I just say that liberalism is not a natural common sense position. No. It is a struggle. I see the world in terms of a Manichaean struggle between the forces of illiberalism and the forces of liberalism, always evolving historically, always specific to particular conditions, and we can never take it for granted. And we need a proactive liberalism in the world which is up to date, encountering the many new forms of illiberalism, and otherwise we're buggered. We are on a hiding to nothing. We're not able to keep the floodgates closed.
Let me say a couple of things to wrap up, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting anyone, but I might, and you will not have a chance to respond. The first was
fascist.
Exactly. What I think has come out of this panel, despite all the different issues that we touched upon, is that right-wing movements, to some extent, to a great extent, are responding to external stimuli, globalization, economic changes, etc., and they are shaped by the forces that impact on them. And so that's important to understand. And whilst we not all agree on whether there is a clear distinction between new and old, it's very clear from what everyone said that there are many different forms of far-right extremism, and I think one of the first tasks for us would be to figure out exactly how they are distinct from each other. In fact, I wrote a book 4 or 5 years ago called Old and New Terrorism, and I kind of waded into exactly the same debate, and I ended up that it is perhaps more useful to speak about older and newer terrorism. There clearly is an evolution, but it is probably not as black and white as the idea old and new suggests. So maybe that's a useful hint for the debate we're going to have in the afternoon. For the time being, I want to thank the excellent panelists, very enthusiastic panelists.